In 1993, I was a 21-year-old long-distance operator working for AT&T out of Worcester, Massachusetts. And one particular afternoon, in the middle of a split shift, where I had some time to venture out downtown, there was an arcade down there that I used to check out every so often. So I walked in, and I heard some loud commotion coming from the back of the arcade. A lot of rumbling, crazy announcer talking about shoes and oh my, and it got my attention enough where I had to see what it was. So I worked my way to the back of the arcade and I see this arcade machine called NBA Jam. And I'm watching the gentleman playing, and it's a 2-on-2 basketball game where there's a whole lot of offense, not a lot of defense. Some ridiculous dunks with 360s and windmills and somersaults. And I was interested. So after watching the gentleman finish the game, he looked over at me and he asked me if I wanted to play. So I said sure. And I ponied up my $2 because it was 50 cents a quarter. And off we went. There's a turbo button, there's a shoot button, and there's a pass button. I understood what the shoot and pass buttons did, but I wasn't quite sure how the turbo would react, and it took me just a little bit to be able to figure out that turbo and shoot in the shooting lanes would make the player dunk, and then turbo and pass would shove opposing players so you could get physical. And after a half, I was only down by about 5 or 6 points. I was starting to learn that the computer was like a rubber band. I was down by 15 at one point. I was putting up threes, and I was able to close the gap. And the computer was just letting anything and everything fall. So I kept things pretty close. I was down about 4 or 5 until we got to the fourth quarter, and I was able to close within one. And there were 5 seconds left. I had the last possession, so I break the ball out of the backcourt or out from underneath my opponent's basket. I work it up just inside a half court. There were about 2.7 seconds left. I heave the ball for one last shot. It goes in. I win by one. The guy that I'm playing against starts to swear, and I'm just blown away by the experience. It was a big roller coaster ride that was punctuated by a lot of really cool looking dunks, a lot of really deep bassy sound, a lot of funny catchphrases, and I was hooked. It was $2 a game, but I must have easily spent $10 that day on NBA Jam alone. And as the months went by and I went to arcades and bars and places that would have the game, I put quarter after quarter, token after token in the game, and that just cemented and has continued to cement for years to come. NBA Jam's Place is my favorite arcade game of all time. Yes, it is my favorite over all the years and all the arcade games that I've ever played. So, flashing forward to 1994, when the home versions of NBA Jam were coming, I was not living in Worcester anymore. I was living just outside of Springfield, Mass, and there had been a pretty big snowstorm the night before, and it was still snowing pretty heavily on launch day. I was bound and determined that I was going to get this game by hook or by crook. So, despite the snow, I called the mall, I called the video game store that was in the mall, and I asked if they were open. He was surprised. He said, sure. So the mall is about 2.25 miles away from where I was living at the time. So I suited up, put my Walkman on, and made the walk to the mall to pick up my copy of NBA Jam and back home. And of course, NBA Jam for the Genesis is what I came home with. I didn't get the Super Nintendo version of NBA Jam, which is right here, for a few months after. Now, the two versions, which are, and I don't want to hold them upside down, so I'll do this here. The two versions of the game are actually very interesting in their differences. If you can only get one, if you're looking to only add one to your collection, because there's really no reason to double dip unless you're me and you're crazy, I would go with the Genesis version, and I'll tell you why very briefly. The biggest difference is that the Genesis version has a battery backup, whereas the Super Nintendo version has passwords that it uses. So if you don't want to write down passwords, get this guy. Also, the Genesis version has some extra music that the Super Nintendo version doesn't have. And these two features, at least to me, make it the better of the two. The Super Nintendo version does look better. Overall, the sound quality is just a little bit better, but I would still go with the Genesis version if you're looking to grab one of the two, and I'll revisit this at the end of the video. So, NBA Jam was a big hit in the arcades. I knew it, a lot of other people knew it, and Midway knew it. So it wasn't too long before an upgrade came out called NBA Jam Tournament Edition. Tournament Edition added some things like being able to swap out players who were injured. There was also the removal of the glass shattering feature that was in the first NBA Jam game that I loved so much. The NBA really wasn't a big fan of shattering the backboard at the time, so they had Midway take it out. So Tournament Edition was still great. I still spent tons of money on that, and then when the home versions came out, the Super Nintendo version is the one that I got first. Now, the good news is that the difference between the Super Nintendo version and the Sega version this time are pretty much non-existent. It depends on which controller you like using better when you're talking about the two games. For me, the Super Nintendo version is better because I like having the turbo option set to the top triggers rather than using the Sega Genesis 3-button controller option where turbo is the B button and you have to kind of roll your thumb between shooting and passing in order to continue to use turbo. That said, the Super Nintendo version still functions a little bit better technically. The graphics look a little cleaner. The sound quality is a bit better. But if you're choosing between the two, then the Super Nintendo version is your better choice. At least until you're talking about the Sony PlayStation version, which is the version that's on my GX TV behind me. The PlayStation version is one of the two reasons that I spent $300 on a PlayStation at launch on September 9th of 1995. That and Ridge Racer were really the two games that pushed me over the top. But the reason that NBA Jam Tournament Edition on the PlayStation I was excited was because finally we were going to get a game that looked almost exactly like the arcade. And for all intents and purposes, it does. Characters scale in and out of your screen. There's a lot more in the way of Tim Kitzrow's sound clips this time around. There are a couple of other features that were just in the arcade that weren't on the home versions, like which teams are popular on your particular machine. For example, if you pick the Houston Rockets more than any team, it'll tell you that the Houston Rockets are the most popular team at your location, like arcades did. And in addition, it tracks some other additional stats, which is pretty cool. The problem with the PlayStation version, if you're looking to get a version of NBA Jam Tournament Edition, is that this version takes almost too much advantage of Tournament Edition's injuries function. And the way that the injury function works is every time that your player is shoved to the ground, his injury stat goes up by 1. And as your injury stat goes up, the player slows down a little bit, his shot accuracy is off a little bit, and it isn't long if you continually shove this player to the ground that the player is just basically worthless and has to be subbed out at the beginning of the next quarter. In the arcade, this worked as well as it should. It didn't adversely affect play to the point where it was more a shoving match than a basketball game. And in the Genesis and Super Nintendo versions, it pretty much stuck to the same line. But in the PlayStation version, for whatever reason, at least what I have found, is that the computer likes to shove a lot more than play basketball. There's also a lot of ridiculous blocks. It's difficult to get into a rhythm offensively. It almost feels too difficult, and it really shouldn't. It doesn't feel as accessible as the arcade version or as the 16-bit console versions felt, and that's kind of too bad. But if I had to judge between NBA Jam and NBA Jam Tournament Edition as far as which one I prefer, I still do prefer the original Jam. It was the first of its kind. There wasn't any worry about shoving a player and trying to make that advantageous for you. And of course, being able to shatter the backboard was the neatest thing, and you can't do that in the Tournament Edition games. Now, one further note before I wrap this up is that for the holidays this year, I used an Amazon gift card, and I was able to get the Sega CD version of NBA Jam, which I did not have up until this year. The Sega CD version of NBA Jam is notable in that there is a lot more music involved that streams off the CD. And for fans of the arcade game, there's also one big difference during the NBA Jam halftime report, um, which is pretty static on the consoles. Uh, but for Sega CD, you actually hear Tim Kitzrow kind of narrate the whole thing. The NBA Jam halftime report, altitude with an attitude, and he says it almost exactly in delivery like he does in the arcade game, enough where the first time that I heard it, I got chills. Maybe that's because I spent way too much money on the arcade game, but whichever. Um, it was a great buy. I got it for just about $5 from a third party seller on eBay. I had it expedited. It got here in great shape, and I'm glad to have it in my library. So, NBA Jam is my favorite arcade game of all time, one of my favorite video games of all time, period. And it began a love affair with Midway Sports games that I would have for years to come. And in future review installments, we'll talk about NBA Jam or NBA Halftime, NBA Hang Time. That's why this is unscripted. NBA Hang Time, NBA Showtime, NFL Blitz, and others. And I'll be making those as we go through the coming weeks. Hope you guys enjoyed this episode of Retro Unscripted. My name is Pete, and we'll see you guys back here really soon.